For early access plus exclusive content, facilitated discussions, live one-on-one Q&As, and more, become a patron at patreon.com/BrucePointset. Welcome to Some Shit I Read. I'm your host, Bruce Pointset, and this is the show where we take passages from literature, dig into why they're meaningful to me, and more importantly, what we all can take from them into our daily lives and movements. Today, we're talking Punisher Max Volume 1 by Garth Ennis. So let's get into it. So I imagine some of you might be thinking, really, Bruce? The same Punisher the killer cops have taken on as a mascot of all the comic book characters? Him? Well, two things. First off, fuck white supremacist cops, ACAB, and all that. Two, I'll be damned if I let them ruin a juicy read. So, with that in mind, I started reading the Punisher Max collection several years ago. And what really hooked me was just they read like these dark morality tales, kind of like basically how a lot of people describe the Old Testament. Basically, you have these series of stories about deeply flawed people trying to outrun a lie, only for it to catch up with them in the form of the Punisher. And every time it ends in the most absolutely gruesome and delightful way. But in this case, we're going to be talking a little bit about the origin story, Born. And this takes it back to Vietnam, which is, for all intents and purposes, where Frank Castle became the Punisher. And like many Vietnam stories, Puns really highlights the hypocrisy and horrors of war. And it really illustrates a template, at least on paper, that we see play out seamlessly to this day in terms of how war is promoted, how it's carried out, and how the cycle continues. So one passage in particular that I think really, really highlights this well is the opening of Born number 4. So with that, let's check it out. So for today's reading, we're going to go to the shared screen. Let's pull out the opening page of Born number 4. There's a great beast loose in the world of men. It awoke in dark times to fight a terrible enemy. It stormed through Europe across the far Pacific and crushed the evil that it found there underfoot. But when it was victorious, when the crooked cross and the rising sun were done with, the great beast's keepers found that it would not go back to sleep. The beast has many heads, and on its heads are written names: Lockheed, Bell, Monsanto, Dow, Grumman, Colt, and many more. And they are very, very hungry. So the great beasts must be fed. In every generation, our country goes to war to do just that. A war for war's sake, usually, and one that could have been avoided. But there must be blood in extraordinary quantities, and whether it is foreign or American is of no consequence at all. And so today at Firebase Valley Forge, our turn has finally arrived. So I'm of the belief that the military-industrial complex is a threat to our collective existence, and obviously most immediately to the people living in the places we invade. Dwight Eisenhower famously called this out in, I think it was his final speech as president. And, in the, almost 70 years since, we've, only seen that materialize. So I came of age in political consciousness during the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations. So that included, of course, 9/11, and then the quote unquote war on terror, where we invaded Afghanistan and then Iraq, as well as, watching the Patriot Act play out here. And, more specifically, watching basically the codifying and legalizing of, our police and intelligence agencies terrorizing brown people. And, to go from that to watching Obama run on hope and change, and then seemingly immediately exponentially increase the use of, targeted predator drone strikes, was jarring, to say the least. When you're just reading through stories of villages getting bombed, communities losing dozens of people at a time, everywhere from not just Iraq and Afghanistan, but Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Djibouti, et cetera, et cetera. And that becomes just a part of your weekly, even oftentimes closer to like daily news consumption. That has an impact on you. And I watched how these wars were used, or how these wars were fueled by the dehumanization of mostly Black and brown people. It starts abroad, but then, of course, again, we look at things like the Patriot Act, we watch how it filters into policy here, even from people who are supposedly well-meaning, but just because you can use the fear carried over from 9/11, the fear of, copycat acts, the fear of whenever there's a story about a bombing in another country being used as justification for us to use military force abroad, and for us to profile and target people here. And you see it just how broadly it gets used. When you have this rhetoric talking about the Muslims attacked us or the Arabs attacked us, this very seemingly obvious racist rhetoric that, again, manifests not just in the bombing, the mass murder of people overseas, but also the treatment here of Arabs, Persians, Muslims, and frankly, anyone, grouped into, again, this category of the brown other. And, so whether it's Sikhs, whether it's Indians, whether it's Christian Arabs, it doesn't matter. You just see this profiling and this, again, codified, legalized enforcement of second-class citizenship against these people. So, again, being impacted by watching this around me, by reading the news of what's happening overseas, by watching, seeing the conflict of, the stories of people being bombed, and watching Jay Carney and other, White House spokespeople come out and flat out deny that this is happening, even though it's known knowledge is a matter of policy. And, again, wrestling with the rhetoric of hope and change and the reality of that, it motivated me to begin, studying the history of this and the patterns. And as alluded to in that excerpt from Pun, but then also just, Dwight Eisenhower, again, decades ago, it always plays out in the same way. And of course it does, because if a template works to achieve the objective, then why would anyone let go of it? It's not going to die easily. I mean, even when we think of Vietnam, it's, we talk about it as a quagmire, as this disaster, but for the efforts of colonization, did it not work? I have a friend who teaches English there, and the way he talks about, the presence of things like the KFCs and their popularity, was Vietnam really a failure to the colonial objective? Never mind the death, never mind the codified racism. Was the objective of colonization and the objective of feeding these beasts, as they talked about in Pun, was that not achieved? So for all intents and purposes. It's just the cost of business of colonization. And besides, are the profiteers, the Lockheeds, the Monsantos, the businesses like the KFCs, how much of that cost are they paying? So the system rolls on. But now the question becomes, so how do we fight back? What do we do about these gigantic systems, these beasts that are literally feeding on the lives of scores of people? I think the first thing we can do is increase our awareness and increase the collective awareness around us. And one way to do that is by putting these issues and these systems in context. A great tool for that is system storytelling. So there's a great article by Justin Wolski on Medium called "What is System Storytelling and How Can It Help Us Learn? The Wire as a Gateway Drug." And in it, I think it has a very, very, very helpful definition of what system storytelling is. So let me just read another passage for it, or read a passage from it for you. The Wire, unlike any show before or since, tackled big ticket themes like the death of work, corruption and pettiness in the police ranks, inequity in our schools, big media cynicism, and the huge con that is the American criminal justice system and beyond. It was like muckraking journalism told in poetry. Beloved characters came and went and returned sometimes, all to serve these huge thematic efforts. There were plot lines to be sure, but they weaved in and out of each other in a way that you never see in other excellent prestige television like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, which depended on iconic characters and propulsive storylines. More than anything, The Wire was less concerned about a group of characters doing things and more about documenting a place and time through characters doing things. It's a unique style of storytelling that I like to call system storytelling. Hashtag to Eugene Wee, who actually came up with this name once over dinner. And it's focused on using characters, places, and events to draw larger thematic points. Now, all good storytelling is serving a theme, from Goodfellas to Gorgia, but sometimes storytellers are really using the characters and plots as pawns toward a bigger, bolder statement. They are less personal and psychological, more schematic and sociological. So we take that look, we can use this as a tool, again, for understanding the world around us, to simplify what was described in that Medium article. The characters in these larger political issues that define our lives, the characters change, but the central systemic issues persist. So let's take this lens of systems and use the Biden administration as an example. Some of the first things that have happened since we had a new president, he ordered a bombing in Syria to send a message to Iran. He also continues the practice of detaining immigrants in wildly inhumane conditions. Even in cases where Biden has tried to push back on some of the cruelty of the Trump administration, institutions like ICE have resisted, creating a subplot in this fight for power within the administration, meanwhile dangling people's lives in the balance. There's really no context where this idea of, Biden's better than that bad guy Trump is an acceptable excuse for this, and turning a blind eye to these really just racist imperialist policies. Yet this is a narrative that we're actively fighting and, quite frankly, losing. This zero-sum good versus bad But remember the last guy, when the systems are still there. And thus, like that intro to Punisher, we have to put the larger system into context. And we have to start doing that hard community education work of deprogramming people from thinking along these simple, good, bad, tribalistic binaries. That means highlighting the systemic disparities, no matter who's in charge, and the disproportionate effects of these policies. Because again, whether it's Biden, whether it's Trump, whether it's Obama, whether it's either Bush, Reagan, you can go back president by president by president, the systems stay the same. That means even highlighting the bigger systemic issues we have, such as what does it mean that we're in this two-party system that is built for us to choose teams and built for us to consume news in horse race fashion, especially, obviously during campaign season? How does that distract us from looking at the systems? It means questioning ourselves and how we play into it. How does the way that, they talk about in The Wire, or in the article about media cynicism depicted in The Wire, how do our own human emotions play into that? How do we feed that? How do we naturally abide by this zero-sum analysis? And how do we let that feed the systems that are harming us, are harming our, fellow neighbors miles and thousands of miles away? We have to look at all these things. We have to apply this systems analysis to the world around us, because that puts it into context. That allows us to say, this is not okay. This continues to happen. It allows us to not get caught up in the jubilation of saying, well, the bad guy's gone, everything's fine now. Kids are still in cages. Things are not fine. So again, when we start at least using this analysis and applying it in our daily conversations, in our daily questioning of ourselves, that's when we start spreading this way of thinking and this ability to start finding solutions for challenging these systemic problems. But as long as we're caught up in these, fairy tale, good versus evil, my team versus your team constructs, we're gonna keep playing into the same systems and the same systems of oppression. And with that very hopeful note, I conclude this episode of Some Shit I Read. Please like, share, and subscribe. And of course, I'd love to hear your comments. Have you read Punisher Max? What did you think of the Vietnam storyline? Did you have a favorite pun kill, whether in Vietnam or any of the other stories? Have you read this, and are you furious with me for not talking about the super, super, super racist Barracuda character and storyline? All those questions and more, let me know in the comments. I'm also hosting a Patreon discussion this month on system storytelling. So if you'd like to join in, become a Patreon member. And there's a link in the description, so you can do that. In the meantime, I'll see you on the next video. Thank you for watching. Please like and share and subscribe so you can stay up to date on all of the latest videos. Thank you.